So welcome all to New Perspectives. I'm Rade and I'm being joined by Vladimir as always, and we are here at the LaGrange Sri Aurobindo Integral Life Center in Fountain Inn, South Carolina. And today we continue our New Perspective series on the ideal of human unity with Sraddhalu Ranade. And of course, we are always extremely grateful when Sraddhalu is able to join us on New Perspectives. So welcome, Sraddhalu. Very nice to have you here today.
Thank you, and I'm very happy to be with all of you.
So today, Sraddhalu will address the topic Sri Aurobindo's warnings against the world state and present trends. And Sraddhalu comments that more than 100 years ago, Sri Aurobindo described the processes by which global power structures would consolidate their hold on humanity and suffocate its freedom, creativity, and life. In hindsight, his words have proved prophetic, but his warnings of what is yet to come could help us to prepare and perhaps change the global future. In his discussion today, Sraddhalu will explore Sri Aurobindo's visionary foresight and warnings against current events and trends and highlight the solutions suggested for the way forward. Most of you are familiar with Sraddhalu, know him well, have been joining his Saturday YouTube's Evenings with Sraddhalu. But for those who may be new, Sraddhalu is a scientist, an educator, and scholar residing at the Sri Aurobindo Ashram. He has influenced over 5,000 teachers throughout India with his immersive workshops on integral education. And he has traveled worldwide in over 30 countries, delivering lectures, conducting workshops on education, management, self-development, and yoga. And today we also have joining us H.P. Rama, who is the chancellor and founder of our university and benefactor of the two Sri Aurobindo Integral Life Centers here in Fountain Inn and in Surat. Welcome, HP. Nice to have you joining us today. And so with that brief introduction, I'd like to go ahead and hand it over to you, Sraddhalu, and I'll just mention to everyone that there'll be plenty of time for questions and answers. So whether you're coming through on our Zoom or through Sraddhalu's YouTube station, please post your questions and we'll get to as many as possible. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Radhi. And it's a theme which I have selected because it is so urgent and so important for everybody on earth. There was a time when we had the illusion that you could say, oh, things are getting bad over there on the other side of the world, and I can ignore it and continue my practice, my sadhana, my meditation, my withdrawal into my cave or my little business or my comfort of life. No more. The compulsions of global integration are so strong, as Sri Aurobindo described 100 years ago, that nobody is left untouched. And if you see a trend happening with a great force on the other side of the world, you need to act now in your space because it will come and hit you at some point. And this was the reason why Sri Aurobindo and the mother had to even put a pause on the larger work of the spiritual manifestation, the supramental manifestation, in order to intervene in the circumstances of the Second World War. The circumstances today are somewhat different because it's not a war, obviously, between two overt powers. It is an imposition on all humanity equally. We are, all of us, part of the war, and therefore an individual pushback and a collective pushback is as essential with our present incapacities or capacities, as was Sri Aurobindo's intervention with his full spiritual force in 1938 and 39. So this is the broad background why I chose this theme. You all know that we are speaking on generally Sri Aurobindo's writings on the ideal of human unity, and I will particularly take one chapter on which I will focus, which is titled The Peril of the World State. But before I actually enter into that text, I want to set the context in which Sri Aurobindo wrote The Ideal of Human Unity, as well as all the other works in the Arya, 1914 to 1920. as Sri Aurobindo is writing, there is what is called the First World War happening already in the middle of Europe. And these two things are happening simultaneously. What happened just before is equally important. And I want to create a kind of a summary of events and trends which had already been set in motion. And when Sri Aurobindo makes observations about the trends, all this is to be understood as the backdrop. First, something extremely important happened, which was with the sinking of the Titanic. Now, that's a famous incident. We've seen nice romantic movies built around it. But what is not known is that with the Titanic sinking, the main banking opposition against the Fed cartel sank. And the man who owned the Titanic and who invited them on board left the Titanic before it sailed off, and he survived. Effectively, the entire opposition towards global financial integration was knocked out. But this is one key event which took place just a few years before. And around the same time, there was the secret train journey in 1910 of the top US bankers who, seeing the current trends and wanting to consolidate global financial power, it began, of course, with consolidating United States financial powers. He invited the top bankers and the richest banking families to come to Jekyll Island for a meeting. They were all supposed to travel in secret without stating their names in a private train coach which went all the way to Jekyll Island. That was in 1910. And there together they planned out the integration of the whole financial system as well as created the US Federal Bank. Woodrow Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act in 1913, which completed that process, and the Federal Reserve was created then, following which a series of chain of events led to a global consolidation of financial powers and systems. This Woodrow Wilson we will come back to a little later shortly, and we'll understand something very important here. His daughter, not at that moment in 1913, but a few years later, his daughter was sitting here at the Sri Aurobindo ashram with the mother and Sri Aurobindo, while Woodrow Wilson won the Nobel Peace Prize for being the architect of the League of Nations, which we will come to shortly. So this was one event which had already taken place, and the forces were set in motion for a globalization of finance. The second thing which happened was the takeover of the oil cartels. Now, the key person here involved was J.P. Morgan and Rockefeller, particularly Rockefeller, who was at that point the key owner of the oil companies, who consolidated his hold, finally became a complete monopoly, which was later broken up into 4 or 5 oil companies. But still, the takeover took place at that point. And 1912, they killed the electric car. All cars till then were electric, and switched by force the entire global economy and the transport systems to oil-based economy. And they also discovered that they could create plastics. So the plastic industry started. 1907-8 is when they discovered the methods, but the industry itself took over, and it was oil-based. And one more thing which they did, they discovered that with the same oil as molecules, they could create any kind of constitute any pharmaceutical materials. So with this began one more takeover, which was, along with the oil cartel takeover, was the takeover of the pharma cartels and pharma industries. As a strategy, and for this again it was Rockefeller who was involved, they put a strategy of literally buying up all the schools which were teaching medicine and converting them to a particular curriculum which was pharma-based, tablet-based. And in this, he was pushing through oil-based pharma materials. So the system of compounding mixtures was eliminated, all was reduced to tablets. They pushed it through, the pills were pushed into the medical education curriculum through large donations. He donated about $100 million in those days. And passed off, there was a particular report which was passed off, which forced all the medical schools to either close down or join his curriculum. The result was the number of schools shrank dramatically and all shifted to the pill-based system. The local medical system, natural plant-based systems were all erased, and came in the pharma companies with doctor kickbacks for tests and prescriptions, etc., which set the pace for the modern consolidation of the pharma cartel. And finally, there was one more thing. It was the time of the peak of world colonization by European states. In fact, the First World War itself was largely a war driven by and aiming for the control and ownership of the worldwide colonies. Why is it called a world war? It was just European countries fighting each other. But they were fighting over what? And on the strength of what? The colonies. And so their fight was reflected in the colonial tensions across the world, and which is the reason why it can be called a world war and not just a European war. Now all this has started, and with all this there is a consolidation happening on a massive scale, and the events have been released. Now it's just a question of unfolding, and that's when Sri Aurobindo begins to write, among other things, the ideal of human unity. And so when he describes some of the forces, and he will use certain vocabularies, he speaks of unseen powers which are compelling things. You have to understand that all this was already in process. And at the end, when the war ends, is also the time when Sri Aurobindo completes or stops writing the Arya. And at that point, the consolidation of global power is done by the League of Nations, which is signed in June of 1919. And US President Woodrow Wilson, he wins the Nobel Peace Prize for being the leading architect for the League of Nations. And this is the time when the mother is here, Sri Aurobindo is here, and with the mother is Woodrow Wilson's daughter living as a sadhika in the ashram. So this is the larger background against which these texts now will make much more sense. Across the world, there was also pressure among the colonies to fight for freedom. The freedom fights had battles for freedom, or reaction at least, or hopes for freedom had begun all over the world around the time of the Second World War. And many looked upon the American freedom struggle as a model. So at this stage, when Sri Aurobindo is writing, the world unification was inevitable. And there's a chapter Sri Aurobindo titles World Union or World State. And this is the question before us. He says there are two options. One is that the whole world moves towards a unity, but a unity which is centralized, like a one world government, authoritarian, mechanical and rule-based, and with an imposed uniformity. Now, you may say that, yes, centralization need not be bad. Even uniformity to a certain extent need not be bad. And we can always say, but there will be limits. It won't go too far. What Sri Aurobindo shows you, and with a compelling logic, with also examples from history, is that once this world state or one world government is in place, it is compelled by its very existence, which may otherwise be threatened, to continue to crush all opposition, including the possibility of free thought. The fact that you can think freely, which means you would be able to speak freely, which would be able to means you would act freely, will threaten this. And therefore, it will inevitably go all the way. You cannot say it will stop somewhere. And this is a very important point that he makes. So, will we have this kind of a world state, or will it be what he suggests is the better way forward, a looser, freer, flexible, living, evolving union of a federal kind, but not very rigidly held, where each nation would have its own distinctive possibility and freedom to exist and find its own way forward. So, this being the background of the choice before us. Remember, Sri Aurobindo at that point is already using his yoga force on world events. It was at that point, 1919, I believe, that Sri Aurobindo and the mother working together, or 1920, Sri Aurobindo and the mother working together are intervening on the higher planes and have initiated the freedom of India. And he says it is done. Further down, He's obviously working on other circumstances of the world, so we don't know too much because he has not spoken about it in much detail. But we now come to the chapter before us, which is titled The Peril of the World State. And I've left a link on the description if for those who would like, but it's not important. I will scan through, touch upon a few key ideas which are important for us. He says here that, first of all, this then is the extreme possible form of a world state, the form dreamed of by the socialistic, scientific, humanitarian thinkers who represent the modern mind at its highest point of self-consciousness and are therefore able to detect the trend of its tendencies, though to the half-rationalized mind of the ordinary man, whose view does not go beyond the day and its immediate morrow, their speculations may seem to be chimerical and utopian. So straight away he is describing two strata in humanity. There are those who are able to see ahead, and then there are those who are half-rationalized, who look only for the present day and who do not see where it's all heading. And then he says, this is the most important thing we have to now appreciate. The state principle leads necessarily to uniformity, regulation, mechanization. Its inevitable end is socialism. Now, why is this so important? Because you will find everywhere on earth today, there are these large organized groups in positions of power which are imposing socialism of some kind or other through the back door, through the front door, in various ways, simultaneously from many directions. Through the media, through the judiciary, through political acts, through non-governmental organizations, through demonstrations, public mayhem, all kinds of things. All are pushing things which lead to uniformity, regulation, mechanization, and practical socialism of some kind. So he says, Sri Aurobindo says, there is nothing fortuitous, no room for chance in political and social development, and the emergence of socialism was no accident. His point is that the very seed of the state idea is going to lead to this. You may try to change the form of the state idea in various ways, but socialism is in the seed, and it is inevitable that it will come through. So it's been about 100 years, more than 100 years since he wrote all this, and we have seen this pattern again and again through this more than 100 years. And he says, a strict unification, a vast uniformity, a regulated socialization of united mankind will be the predestined fruit of our labor. Any attempt to unify will tend to go in this direction. So, what can you do to prevent this? He says, the result can only be avoided if an opposite force interposes and puts in its veto. So, we need an opposing force. We need the force of people who will push back against this. And if that does not happen, this is inevitable. So, I'm going to read from a portion where he discusses this. He says, he uses this phrase in the national life in Asia, where the state idea was prevented from going full out. He says, in the national life, the life of the people and the values of the people opposed its full intolerant development. Now, this is a very important phrase. Full intolerant development of the socialist idea. And something within us, individually, collectively, has to push back to prevent this. And it's like this. If you don't push back, this is inevitable. If you do push back, you will prevent its full intolerant development, but with that, you may have a chance to then bring in the actual framework of a loose federation. You cannot say we will go only for a loose federation ignoring this. It doesn't work like that. This the way things happen in the nature of the state idea itself, in the nature of an attempt to unify. So, the pushback becomes critical for us. So in the condition in Asia particularly, he says the real life of the people was determined by other powers and the state machine existed in a restricted manner. Now I want to put this in context of modern circumstance, particularly with the United States Constitution, which is quite exceptional in a certain way. And what is fascinating to see is, as long as the American public had in their education the appreciation of their constitution, those values were held in the collective consciousness. More recently, in the last couple of decades, this has been removed from the educational system. And children grow up with no idea of the values which are enshrined. And the key value in the American Constitution is this, and it's so declared, that all your rights, all your liberties are essentially God-given. No human being, no constitution, no government gives you those rights. First, everything you have is given by God. But in order to organize ourselves, we forego of something of our freedom and assign the power to the constitution for purpose of governance. Now, this is how the original thinking in the writers of the constitution is. That we are always free, but we choose to withhold a certain scope of our freedom and grant an authority to the Constitution for purpose of this collective harmonization. But anything which is not granted to the Constitution is not for it to take away. You have a God-given liberty, a God-given right. It's not given to you by the Constitution. And you contrast this with the thinking which comes with the British Constitution and with the Indian Constitution, which is largely a derival of the British Constitution, that the Constitution gives you a freedom, the Constitution gives you a right, and you have to be subservient to the Constitution. It's a complete 180-degree opposition in perspective. And this is extremely important to understand because we have been brought up, brainwashed to be subservient to the law and the constitution and the system. Without questioning, is this the system that we want? How far are we going to allow the system to oppress us? In the framework of the American Constitution's formulation and its values, that question is always present. At any point, if the Constitution overrides your basic freedom, you have a right to overthrow it even. And there is the Second Amendment in the US Constitution which says that people have a right to form militias to protect themselves and to protect their right of freedom if ever the government becomes too oppressive. And that's enshrined in the framework itself. It's interesting. Very interesting. And so this whole debate over arms and carrying of arms in the USA has a very different basis from what the media tells us. But I'm not going to go into that now. It's just to show you the different approach of value. And Sri Aurobindo is hinting that in the Asian region at least, there was something of this kind of an approach where the government itself was allowed only up to a certain point. And now we come to something important here. What is it in us that we have to hold and to stave off this oppression of the state? Sri Aurobindo writes, some such unity for the human race is possible. The unity that is where we can hold a unity, a global unity, without losing our innate freedoms. Some such unity is possible in the place of an organized world state, if the nations of mankind succeed in preserving their developed instinct of nationalism intact and strong enough to resist the domination of the state idea. This is so important. Because without this, the state idea will overwhelm and will crush. And we will read the passage where he discusses how it will crush. What is needed is, if the nations of mankind succeed in preserving their developed instinct of nationalism intact and strong enough. So you must have an instinct of nationalism which is sufficiently developed to begin with. Now this is not the case with all. It's not the case everywhere. But wherever it is, at least, the possibility of pushback is stronger. Where it is not, it needs very quickly to rebuild or build enough, mature enough that it can become strong and push back. So this instinct of nationalism is the principal bulwark on a collective level against the state idea. And again, I'm pointing to this, highlighting it, because you will find suddenly across the world, everywhere, in the media, in the news, in the cinema, entertainment, and in our educational system, including textbooks, there is a concerted effort to vilify the concept of nationalism, to suppress the national idea, and to create a kind of a uniformity of masses by blending and mixing all the races, all the types, as if they are all equal and one and the same, which is not the case. Each race is community, each nation, each culture has had certain distinctive attainments and characteristics, types, tendencies, and even needs for its development. And yes, they should all blend together and work together if necessary, but without losing their individuality and their distinctive strengths by which they can nourish and assist the others. But what is demanded and what is pushed on us is this blending. And the blending in which the idea of nationality or nationalism is seen as something negative and harmful, to be erased, suppressed, to be even crushed. And this is happening in a very large way. You must be careful, because your children are being brought up with these ideas. Make sure that deep in their heart, they learn to love their country, they love their culture, they love the higher values which their civilization has aspired for, attempted to realize, even if not fully or perfectly. This is so important. And that individuality of a national identity in a healthy way as the soul of a nation is so important here, because it's the primary bulwark against this world state organization. If this pushback can take place, Sri Aurobindo says, then the result would then be not a single nation of mankind and a world state, but a single human people with a free association of its nation units. He even says, in some ways, the nation as we know it might disappear, but there would be other kind of group units, etc. But with a peaceful international order. So, next he asks the question, what would be preferable in terms of these two possibilities which may happen before us? And he begins by highlighting the benefits of the organized, hierarchical world state, centralized world state. Obviously, its benefit would be that immediately you would have an assured world peace. He compares it to the Roman Empire, and he says it won't be totally secure. There will be somewhere certain tendencies and strife between subgroups, but overall peace would be assured. And the consequence of that, I will read now because this is so important, and enjoy the positive aspects which he will highlight. So he says a great number of problems would be solved. The vital life would fall into a rational order. And so peace assured, he says, there would be an unparalleled development of ease and well-being. So problems, lots of problems solved, vital life organized, and then at first there would be a great cultural and intellectual efflorescence. Science would organize itself for the betterment of human life and the increase of knowledge and mechanical efficiency. The various cultures of the world, those that still exist as separate realities, would not only exchange ideas more intimately, but would throw their gains into one common fund, because now everything is being mixed, right? So everybody is participating. And new motives and forms would arise for a time in thought and literature and art. Men would meet each other much more closely and completely than before, develop a greater mutual understanding, rid of many accidental motives of strife, hatred, and repugnance which now exist, and arrive, if not at brotherhood, yet at some imitation of it, a sufficiently kindly association and interchange. There would be an unprecedented splendor, ease, and amenity of this development of human life. And no doubt, some chief poet of the age, writing in the common or official tongue, shall we say, Esperanto, he's taking a dig, he's poking fun at those ideas of this uniformity, and Esperanto was supposed to be the language to unify the world. And in the common official tongue would sing confidently of the approach of the golden age, or even proclaim its actual arrival and eternal duration. And again, there's a very subtle humor he throws at you, some chief poet of the age, because when you have this kind of organized system, the system selects who will be representative of experts on climate, experts on economy, expert on social whatever problems, expert on, and so you will have a chief official poet who will sing and say this is it. But, Sri Aurobindo writes, after a time there would be a dying down of force, a static condition of the human mind and human life. Then stagnation, decay, disintegration. The soul of man would begin to wither in the midst of his acquisitions. And he points to the Roman Empire as an example of exactly this particular pattern. So he says the result would come about for the same essential reasons as in the Roman example. The conditions of a vigorous life would be lost. Liberty, mobile variation, and shock upon each other of freely developing differentiated lives. So, what are the conditions of a vigorous life? First, freedom. Second, variations but which are able to move around. And third, the shock then of these different perspectives, positions, ideas, values, even cultures colliding and compelling certain kinds of changes, introspections, etc., to allow for a free development but of differences. If you remove these three things, then you will have this decay, disintegration, beginning with stagnation. Now, this is not something too far off, too far-fetched. We have an excellent model of this already established in the world going back about at least 20 years, and that is in the Chinese Communist Party and its rule over China. Now, I'm not saying the model is China. I'm saying the model is the Chinese Communist Party in the way it is ruling China. And you see exactly this happening. There is this compulsion top-down. The national life is organized in such a way. Language has been enforced to become uniform, and everywhere a uniform curriculum, uniform ideas, uniform values, uniform thought. You're not allowed to speak of certain things. So there's a gigantic machinery behind the scenes which is monitoring the internet, which is monitoring social interchange, and China has banned, for example, the American social media. So you will not find Facebook, but China has its own particular media which is controlled by its government. And all this is necessary, even essential, if this top-down control for peace, for well-being of the Chinese people is to be retained without being questioned or threatened. And so there's a massive machinery monitoring all this and censoring, sometimes within seconds. For example, in China, you cannot use the word Tiananmen Square and the event which happened 3 decades ago. The younger generations don't even know it. Those who do know it will pass on eventually, and the event itself will be erased from the official history. Now, in a healthy, free society, if a mistake has been made, and even if you think it was not a mistake, there should be space for open debate. And it does not matter what the conclusion of the debate is. The fact of the debate and the free discussion of the debate is essential. The final outcome may go whichever way it is. And of course, if that final outcome begins to question or threaten the organized society, then the organization is flawed. We need an organization which is flexible enough, true enough, which will last, which will allow for this kind of discussion and debate without being disbalanced, without feeling threatened. So we have a very good example of this, and you need only look at what is happening in China. You have seen there, at least in an initial phase, all of the efflorescence which Sri Aurobindo speaks of. And we have also seen the beginning of the stagnation and decay. Disintegration, yes, in certain pockets, but the stagnation and decay is pretty obvious also for those of you who have been monitoring trends of thought at least. So this Loss of liberty, loss of mobile variation. That's again something we see very clearly in China. Because of the social controls and restrictions, you have something called social points. If you don't conform to a certain ideology, belief, and behavior pattern, you lose points. And if you don't have enough points, you're not allowed to travel outside your city, you're not allowed special access to certain facilities, and so on. Now, all this is important to understand because this is the direction inevitable for this world state and its domination. And Sri Aurobindo will explain why. So he points out that perhaps we might think that, well, there is a democracy, so such a thing could not happen because, well, under democracy at least, we would preserve our freedom. Sri Aurobindo makes a fascinating insight here. He says, democracy is by no means a sure preservative of liberty. We would have thought as long as you have democracy, freedom would be protected. He says, no, it's by no means a sure preservative. On the contrary, he says, we see today the democratic system of government march steadily towards such an organized annihilation of individual liberty as could not have been dreamed of in the old aristocratic and monarchical systems. So you look back at the monarchy and aristocracy and the suppression of liberties within those frameworks, and today's democracy is actually heading for a greater suppression of liberties. And for this, I would point to several examples. A good one is immediately as seen is in Canada, where the democracy itself has been used to suppress the voices of people and to threaten into subjugation the farmers who questioned or demanded their freedom, and similar tendencies you see in Australia, where a similar kind of social credit system is being already introduced. And in the European Parliament, again, there have been discussions about social credits and forms in which this needs to be brought. So democracy itself can be usurped for an outcome which is the very opposite of freedom. Because you got elected democratically, having been elected, you can usurp the freedom completely. Or we see this in the democracy such as banana republics, where once having been elected, you can do pretty much what you like, including suppress people, threaten people, even kill people, and get away with it, because you, in the position of power, can control the entire machinery. And so that's how we have despots and dictators who democratically get elected. So democracy in itself, he says, is not enough. He says, it may be that from the more violent and brutal form of despotic oppression, which were associated with those systems, democracy has indeed delivered those nations. And that is no doubt a great gain. But he comes to something. There is a deprivation of liberty which is more respectable in appearance through the democratic process, more subtle and systematized, more mild in its method, because it has a greater force at its back, but for that very reason more effective and pervading. The tyranny of the majority has become a familiar phrase, and its deadening effects have been depicted with a great force of resentment by certain of modern intellectuals. So he gives an example of a drama. But what the future promises us is something more formidable still, the tyranny of the whole, of the self-hypnotized mass over its constituent groups and units. And here he gives the example of fascist Italy and Soviet Russia, which I've already moved into that at the time when he is writing this. Now, this is a passage which is extremely important, and I want to dwell on this a little more because he's pointing to things which he's seeing in the future for which there is not yet a vocabulary, including what today we call artificial intelligence. But I'm going ahead of myself. Let's look at the text here in a little bit of detail. First of all, he says, because of democracy, you have a respectable appearance. I'll give an example in India, which used to be until about 10 years ago, that you had the ballot and the politicians fought a battle to win at the ballot, except what would happen, and this was very common even until recently in West Bengal, in Tamil Nadu, the ballot box itself would be taken after the ballots have been posted and would be put in a strong room for counting the next day. And at night, the politician would come with his own box, with his own ballot stuffed, switch the ballot boxes. Now it's done in such a way that everybody knows about it by local gossip, oral communication. But there is no way to prove it because they control the whole machinery and the police. There's no way you can prove it. So everyone knows that the election is hijacked, and yet you continue to play the game, and of course you lose hope. You say, what's the point? Something similar you see in a more complex manner in the United States, where there is what is called the uniparty. Both sides, both parties of the major parties will come together whenever it involves funding wars. And it doesn't matter which war it is. They will raise the right words, but they will send out billions of dollars to fund the wars for the benefits that they get. And all the parties are together in that. And issues over which they fight are often trivial and superficial. So do you actually have a living democracy, or are both parties or the members of the parties paid for by those who own the banks or the financial powers? And do you really have a democracy? So what he points out here is you have the illusion. It's much more subtle, much more systematized, but it has a greater force at its back, except that that force, more effective, more pervading, but invisible. Who actually controls? We don't know. We can't know even. We can speculate. We can say, oh, it is such and such industries. But who controls those industries? Who are the actual rulers? We do not know. And we are left with this illusion of a democracy. But there's a tyranny of a majority, which can happen with democracy, where the overwhelming majority now snuffs out the freedom of the smaller minorities. But there's something more serious he points to, and this is what is today existent all over the world, which he says is what the future promises us is something more formidable still, the tyranny of the whole. Now, what does that actually mean? The whole includes all the minorities. There's no majority or minority. There is the whole which is somehow sitting on top and suppressing each individual. And what is this whole? Who runs it? Who represents it? Nobody, or invisible. So there is the tyranny of the whole, of the self-hypnotized mass over its constituent groups and units. The mass itself is so hypnotized that it imposes its will on the group without even realizing it. They live in some kind of a strange, sometimes false, illusory belief system. Now, I want to give a few examples of this. We have, for example, what took place during the COVID. The entire humanity was pushed to fear of the uncertain, of the unknown. Everybody will die. And the entire mass now began to as if suppress any individual who dares to question. And you saw that in the media in ways which was quite horrible. Some of those statements, if today, because the mood has now shifted, if you watch those statements today, you had famous people actually saying those who question whatever it is which is not allowed to be questioned ought to be hanged, ought to be guillotined, and violently, forcefully, fearfully demanding violent action against those who questioned or dared to think differently from the fear-mongering that was being imposed on the collective. And this was just one example. There have been others, some of which are still in process of being built up. You get labeled if you question certain issues regarding the changing temperatures or climate and so on. Just the fact that you want to discuss is enough to get you labeled and to get you cancelled. Something which happened very interestingly, and because more and more this is shifting from imposition of a group and a few individuals to an automated system using artificial intelligence. So there's something very interesting which happened, and I discovered this only recently. I had a discussion on the theme of several topics. There were many questions. Among them was a question on whether vaccines could actually affect the consciousness of a person. And the fact that this question was raised and was answered from a spiritual perspective was enough to alert the artificial intelligence, and the entire YouTube video got deleted. And the system didn't inform me that it has been deleted. And it's only recently someone was looking for it, did not find the number, informed me of it. I go on the YouTube site and there's nowhere that I'm being told it's been deleted. If I look for it by searching for a keyword, find the link and try to open it, it says, this has been deleted because you did not follow what? Community guidelines. Now this is the dangerous word. Community guidelines, if you do not fit into those guidelines, you can be cancelled, you can be deleted, you can be suppressed, you can be denied liberties. But who decided those community guidelines? You did not. The community did not. Even your elected representatives did not. It's a private company that chose something which it declared as community guidelines. Now if, for example, you look at community guidelines of YouTube or any one of these media companies, they will say you're not allowed to, make statements which are, and they will very loosely say, critical of whatever communities which are racist, etc. Now, what is a racist statement is not defined. So everything comes back to somebody's subjective view of whether you have violated a community guideline or not. And I give an example here. Recently it happened that a German politician was convicted as a crime for incitement of hatred, because in a social media post, she discussed rape statistics in Germany. And the point was that there was a particular immigrant community from a particular country which stood out dramatically higher in the rape statistics. And she asked, but how is this, or why is this community suddenly in higher number? Just raising this question or pointing out the statistics which are already published, which are visible, which are a matter of reality of measurement, gets her a conviction of a criminal count, and she has to pay 6,000 euros for having violated this, whatever you would call it now, community guideline. It's not even a law for that matter. So something is happening on a massive scale, but it's happening so quietly, so silently, that we are not even conscious of an imposition of this tyranny of the whole. And he calls it something more formidable still than anything they could imagine 100 years ago. The self-hypnotized mass over its constituent groups and units. And the mass itself can go into this state of hypnosis by fear or by belief or by whatever form of influence has been placed. And the problem is, when the mass is like this, you dare not speak. Because if you speak, even question, you're afraid of being somehow knocked out. So you conform. You conform to what appears to you the mass belief, and you become a part of the mass hypnosis. For example, it's something very subtle, it's happening today. You dare not criticize by name of community anybody, by name of culture or religion anybody, by sometimes in certain spaces you dare not say even a term man or woman, because it has become somehow politically incorrect. The Supreme Court of India recently passed an order which was about rights for birthing people. What does that mean? Birthing people. People who give birth. Normally you would have said for women. No, but it has to be birthing people. You can't say woman or man, because that is not acceptable in the woke belief, framework, culture, or whatever form that takes. So there is a situation here where later on Sri Aurobindo actually uses this phrase, against this power the individual is much more helpless than he was against old oppressions. We will come to this shortly. But this self-hypnotized mass, the mass itself has hypnotized itself into a belief. And you find people applauding when what they see is ridiculous, foolish. But to say it even on a platform like this might get you cancelled, because this is under community guidelines of social media. For example, some years ago there was a girl who was promoted by certain interests, who was made to stand in the United Nations and made to abuse all the UN leaders of the world, heads of state who were elected, and she was a nobody except a political prop, and declared shame on you. And the entire mass stood up and applauded her for saying that, for abusing them. You look at that and you applaud because you're conforming and fitting into a certain belief system, not realizing that you're under a hypnosis. If you came from a different planet, or if you looked at this scenario from a different era, let's say 100 years ago, if you were told that one day all the elected heads of state would be sitting together and a girl who is a puppet for a certain financial machinery comes up and says, shame on you, and they stand up and applaud, you would say, what kind of nonsense are you talking about? But today you can't say that because you've been kind of sucked into this self-hypnosis. And because we're all in it, we can't even recognize we're in it. And that's why he says something more formidable still in the future. Now, this is a point Sri Aurobindo makes. Democracy can work only under two conditions. First, you have to have an effective and personal share of each citizen in the actual government, legislation, administration of the community. Each one must have an effective and personal share. Then democracy has a meaning. So let's say we are a community of 50 people. Let's have a democratic decision on this. Each one states, puts forward a position, can state a variation, a correction, and say, you know what, this is right, but it needs to be done in this way, and everybody hears it. You are effective. Whether it is accepted or not is secondary. You are effective in your opinion, in your intervention, in your participation in the actual decision making. Now replace that in India by 1 billion people, or 300 million or 400 million in the United States, or any small country which has even 1 million people. Do you actually have an effective and personal share in the legislation or in the administration or in the community? No. What you have, Sri Aurobindo uses this phrase, the personal share, he says, cannot be effective in the government. He can only have an equal share. You don't have an effective share, you have an equal share. Your vote is as equal as everybody else. And he says, Sri Aurobindo writes, illusory for the individual, though effective in the mass. So if collectively we all vote for X, we have been effective. But for the individual, it is illusory. Actually, whether you vote or not makes no difference on that level. Your opinion of why you vote or don't vote, or what should have been a particular legislation or form of it, makes no difference. So already the first condition for effective democracy has failed there. The second condition, he says, for effective democracy is a great freedom of individual temperament and action. But this also today you don't have. So, and he speaks about this. Finally, he points out that the legislators who are elected, they do not really represent the electors. The person who got elected is part of some kind of an elite system, position, power, financial influence of some kind. They're not your people. I think it's only recently that we have had a prime minister who was not an elite, and that is, in India at least, that is Narendra Modi, who was a tea seller in his childhood and has been part of what is called backward communities, etc., and has actually lived at the grassroots all his life and worked his way up into the power structure, which is exceptional, and this is the reason why the entire media is violently against him. And they even rebuke him for being an ordinary man compared to others who represent an elite against whom he is fighting. It's interesting. So, but something more important Sri Aurobindo points to. The legislators, the power they represent is another. And this is perhaps the single most important part of the text. The power they represent is another, a formless and bodiless entity, which has taken the place of monarch and aristocracy. That impersonal group being which assumes some sort of outward form and body and conscious action in the huge mechanism of the modern state. Formless, bodiless entity, has taken the place of the king, of the aristocracy. It's a group being, but it is impersonal, and it has some form of outward body and even a conscious action, and that is what rules and controls this modern state. Now, there are two aspects to this. One is a psycho-spiritual aspect, and the other is a practical, physical, material, technological aspect to it. And I'm going to touch upon both. The first is that, yes, there is a group consciousness. And within this imposition of a group identity, fear, values, and the self-hypnosis of the mass is a being which is formed. And that being now grips the minds and compels the minds to fit in. You see this in certain very organized, large religions. Being part of the religious mindset, you come under the grip of the power of the religion, and if at any point the trigger words which the religion has embedded in you are activated, you'll find yourself disturbed or drawn to die for the religion or whatever form it takes, and we see enough of that. I don't need to give examples. It's a hypnosis, but there's a power, a being which forms by this consolidation of the consciousness and the energies behind, and power with a capital P. But there is also a technological aspect to this, because this power needs to rule by some means, by some mechanism. And so in the early days, it was by forming a coterie of people who were under the sway of the same force. If we may take the example of a pretty extreme kind, in the Nazi Germany during the Second World War, you had the main leader who was, let's say, a medium for an Asuric power, but surrounded now by people who were strongly held by this, in the grip of the same dominant influence. Well, there it was too obvious. Today in other countries it is not so obvious, because the way this grip works is also not very visible, because everyone has learnt that they have to speak the correct platitudes. But this has institutionally spread through political power, banking circles, media, judiciary, bureaucracy, and industries and education. It has entrenched itself across all the spectrum of the power systems which build for the long-term hypnosis of the mass. But it has a more material form which is today becoming visible under the name of artificial intelligence. Because at the end of the day, you cannot rely on numbers of people who may turn against you. And with the benefit today that we have of the internet and the mobile phone and the shared framework of social media, the machinery which wants the world state and to grip the minds of humanity can enter into your pockets, and through the screen of your telephone or your social media now feed you. That's why it's called a feed you what it wants, to shape you and mold you in its thought structure. And who is this being? And it's not even the people who control the social media, it's the people who built the artificial intelligence, and the artificial intelligence now as a self-sustaining entity. And the people who control the artificial intelligence only tweak certain patterns. For example, they will teach it to be woke, to speak responses in certain ways, to avoid certain types of responses. Other than that, the specific form of it is not even in their control. And the great fear is that the artificial intelligence itself can go rogue in a way that they will not be able to control. And because it grips humanity, it will follow its own survival needs, which is to swing humanity in a direction that serves its mechanical or other intelligence. But the artificial intelligence is also representative of a kind of a group consciousness. Now, this is the deeper occult as well as the technological reality behind this. And so of this power, Sri Aurobindo writes, against this power, the individual is much more helpless than he was against old oppressions. When he feels its pressure grinding him into uniform molds, he has no resource except either an impotent anarchism. So you sit in your armchair and shout all your anarchistic claims and demands, but with no effect. Or else retreat, still to some extent possible, into the freedom of his soul or the freedom of his intellectual being. So you withdraw. You say, well, the world is going to dogs. What can I do? I am helpless. I will do my sadhana. I will go into my little corner. I will live out my comfortable life because I can do nothing. So this, Sri Aurobindo points out that the full freedom of speech and thought as was briefly achieved in modern times is far greater than in the past gains of modern democracy. And he says, as long as this freedom endures, the fear that humanity would go into this stagnation is groundless, especially if it's accompanied by universal education. But then he explains, precisely because there is this machinery now, the freedom of thought, freedom of speech, and then the third liberty, which is the freedom of association. And these three go hand in hand eventually. He says these can be easily also suppressed. If you can put a padlock on speech, you cannot have freedom of thought, even freedom of association. So the question is, will this suppression of liberties continue? And he says it is possible that the future has certain surprises for us in this direction. This is when he first wrote. Then he comments, before he left his body a year before, he says, a surprise no longer, but more and more an accomplished fact. He says, at the moment, freedom of speech and thought exists no longer in Russia. It was entirely suspended for a time in Germany and Southern Europe. So, everything he pointed to had happened. But still, he has anticipated a much worse situation in the world. So, freedom of thought would be the last human liberty directly attacked by the all-regulating state, which will first seek to regulate the whole life of the individual in the type approved by the communal mind or by its rulers. So the true rulers today, you see, are not even the politicians. You could say they are the bankers because they fund the politicians, and they are those who control the social media and the artificial intelligence of the social media. These are the people who finally set the agenda, so to say. But when it sees how all important is the thought in shaping the life, it will be led to take hold of that too, by forming the thought of the individual through state education and by training him to the acceptance of the approved communal, ethical, social, cultural, religious ideas, as was done in many ancient forms of education. Only if it finds this weapon ineffective, it is likely to limit freedom of thought directly on the plea of danger to the state and to civilization. So if after brainwashing through the education and through media, if it still finds it cannot control the thought, then it will directly say you're threatening state or civilization. And then he says, already we see the right of the state to interfere with individual thought announced here and there in a most ominous manner. We would have imagined religious liberty at least was assured to mankind, but recently we have seen an exponent of new thought advancing positively the doctrine that the state is under no obligation to recognize the religious liberty of the individual. And that even if it grants freedom of religious thought, it can only be considered as a matter of expediency, not of right. There is no obligation, it is contended, to allow freedom of cult. And he says this is logical. If state has to regulate the whole life of the individual, it must have the right to regulate religion. And because it's such an important part of the life and thought and people. Now again, I want to point out that none of this is occasional anymore. In China, this is the norm. China actually has rewritten, you'll be shocked to know this, has rewritten an edited version of the Quran, which is the only official Quran which the Chinese Muslims are allowed to follow. And not a squeak from any of the religious countries in the Middle East. China has created its own independent church, which is controlled by the state, in which an official Catholicism is allowed but controlled by the state. And the same for Buddhism, which is now enshrined under the overall framework of the Chinese Communist Party. So everything has already been organized, and with this a surveillance state has been put place on a scale which is controlled by artificial intelligence, on a scale that is unimaginable today. And it's not spoken about openly because it is so scary when you think about it. Every street corner has a video camera which can recognize a face. So there are videos of this demonstrating. As you see through the video camera, a dozen people on bicycle or car, the camera instantly recognizes the face and you show on a text of the name on the head of each. Now consider with artificial intelligence monitoring each person. You step out of your house, you go to the shop, you buy some food, you go somewhere else, you do something and you come back and you have a routine. Artificial intelligence is monitoring your routine. The day you deviate from the routine, it raises a red flag. Every statement you make on social media, including your expression of frustration, anger, affection, like or dislike, you put a thumbs up or thumbs down, or even you use a keyword, it triggers on the artificial intelligence monitoring, which sees your entire pattern of behavior and identifies you as a potential troublemaker, and straight away the state acts upon you in anticipation of the trouble you might cause in future. Again, for those of you who might not know this, the Uyghur Muslims, which are in the southwest part of China, have been taken in the millions in what is called re-education camps, where for weeks and months they have been put through indoctrination processes before being allowed to go back to their normal life within the framework of the new indoctrination, and not a squeak by any of the other Islamic countries. Interestingly, and why? Because of the dominating power which is behind. So what I'm showing you is something which is already happening through social media, through communications. Sri Aurobindo actually uses this word, individual expression and opinion. All of these, any free discourse and debate. You cannot discuss climate change. You cannot discuss the jab and those things. You cannot discuss things which are not permissible by the social media guidelines, community guidelines, which you never chose, by the way. So you live in an implicit fear of being watched, criticized, cancelled, denied facilities, or even imprisoned for thinking freely. But your thought is actually monitored. In the extreme today, Facebook, Instagram, actually watch your face through the camera of your phone. They recognize if you're happy, sad, disturbed, angry. Your state of emotion is recognized with some 80%, 90% accuracy, and they feed you content to manipulate your state. That's how far the technology actually operates under control of AI. So you end up having to conform out of this implicit fear even to falsehood. And as I pointed out earlier, you cannot say certain things even openly today. This withdrawal into an internal intellectual freedom eventually leads to a stagnation with a helplessness. And so Sri Aurobindo concludes this. The world state cannot permit freedom of thought because it would end up criticizing the world state. So it would tolerate it so long as it did not translate itself into individual and associated action. But the moment it spread or turned towards a practical self-affirmation in life, the whole principle of the state and its existence would be attacked, and its very base would be sapped and undermined, and in imminent danger. To stop the destruction at its root, or else consent to its own subversion, would be the only alternative before the established power. And so the necessary consequence would be a static order of society without freedom, and it will then settle into the rut or the groove of a regulated perfection, or something to which it gives the name of rationality of system, and the communal mass will remain always conservative and static. He says the only way this can be reversed, he says the free individual is the conscious progressive, and it is only when he is able to impart his own creative and mobile consciousness to the mass that a progressive society becomes impossible. And so in conclusion, Sri Aurobindo points to this, that we need to protect the individual freedom, allowing the free groupings of local cultures, individual, local, regional, national. And then I quote now, he says, with full encouragement and flowering of the individual, local, regional, national mind and power in the firm frame of a united humanity. And for achieving this, for whatever governance system that we would need to manage, he says the parliamentary system is not good enough. The federation, a world federation in the current American form or the Germanic form are not good enough. And a fundamental inner change is required also for a higher form of a federal structure to be implemented, for which he says there are two things. One is nature's way of increasing closeness of common interests, which is a more external operation, and the other is nature's way using the force of common uniting sentiments, religious, intellectual affinities, but also spiritual and deeper values, which is happening today through the social media, through internet, through online gatherings such as this. It is happening also through exchange of cultures, through certain kinds of cinema, through food, travel, tourism, contact, one-on-one meetings, whether virtual or online now, does not matter too much. Through these, we are beginning to get in touch with a larger humanity, and if we can do this on a deeper basis, on a deeper foundation, then this assertion of the individual freedom to push back against the extreme forms that the world state will try to impose on us can still happen, and this would be what might still save humanity. So this is where I want to pause. It's been a bit of a perhaps harsh worldview, because what we are looking at is not so very comfortable to face, but it highlights our role individually and collectively, but also from a deeper poise of consciousness. So I'll pause here, and if there are any questions, we could look at them.
Thank you.
I'll leave it to Vladimir and Radhe to choose the questions.
Right. Right. There are some comments here, and of course, there has to be some kind of reflection upon this. Thank you very much for doing this overview, because this socialistic view had to be given, once properly, totally, deeply, that the danger of it. And from here, something comes that Sri Aurobindo is a prophet of actually individualism, because only through individual the real connection to the divine can take place, and that will build the society, proper society. And if that is cut or belittled or made small, then the society will stagnate and finally collapse, as Roman Empire did, and any other empire will do. And we see, as you rightly said, they decline already in Chinese, and they try to expand to take markets in Europe, buy countries, because there is no way that they can maintain that kind of control, full control.
Yes.
So they need fresh meat somewhere to get into the system. Yes, so beautiful kind of warning, because this is typical for Sri Aurobindo. And by the way, what I got from your presentation, also one small remark, which is quite interesting, that it is the doings of nature. He says that nature is interested in the types more than individuals, and she can actually sacrifice individuals and groups for the type to come to the, she builds this human unity in her way, so to say. But
yes, Sri Aurobindo points to two things: nature's processes externally, and then the inner push of the divine within, which is also choosing a certain direction and brings forward forces which will perhaps awaken humanity at the moment of the extreme crisis, when otherwise we might be suppressed because of the external machinery. The soul might still push back, and suddenly there'll be an awakening in the mass.
Yes, that is the balance.
And actually,
if not for this, we would have no hope. Yes.
Maybe I'll just jump in here too on this topic, because you're mentioning the soul can push forward. So my question, as you were speaking about the suppression of nationalism, is what role does the nation's soul play in all this? And as nationalism is suppressed more and more, what happens to the nation's soul? Does it dissipate? Does it remain there until the time comes that it can be a force on its own? Can you maybe just address it from
Yes,
the nation's soul perspective, please?
yes. There's an interesting message of the mother where she says, and this is in the 1950s, the soul of India is conscious of her mission in the world, but she is waiting for the external means to manifest it. I think I've got the quotation pretty much accurate. But it's an interesting. The soul is conscious of her mission, it's awake, but the external means are lacking. Another example is, again, Mother's comment in the agenda where she says, Sri Aurobindo and I have been looking for the right man who can lead India. And then she said in the 1960s, she said, we found one, but they killed him in Kashmir. That was Shama Prasad Mukherjee. Imagine they found one at that time. One only. Not 10. One. So from the perspective of the soul of the nation, it needs instruments. But instruments' fundamental requirement would be, first of all, an opening to that, the soul's influence, but also that it would set aside its personal preference in order to fulfill that which is the greater truth. So effectively, it has to be somebody with a deep spiritual foundation in which already the opening to the divine will and its execution in life has been sufficiently aligned. And such a person now entering into the national life, I don't mean always politics, it can be other means also, but such people need to enter national life to have that benefit for the soul to be able to act directly. Otherwise, what we will say, the soul will still act through the existing mixed instruments, including the antagonistic instruments, but the result will be a chaotic outcome and a slow and chaotic transition to what the soul wants, the soul of the nation.
Thank you.
Probably this also imposition of the nature on the soul being present, it creates this what we call the ego sense, because the soul is there, but the nature also wants to join the party in some way, and they generate this distortion. And you are rightly pointing out that this nationalism is being not welcome all over the world, starting from Nazism. So nationalism is understood only in negative terms. There is no positive nationalism. There is no positive love for your country, your culture, your history.
Right.
There's only you are promoting yourself. Somehow it was distorted from the Second World War, from the Hitler's time.
Yes, that word got a bad rap. But also you must understand the word Nazi itself comes from nationalist, socialist party.
Yes.
So it was socialist in its framework, and therefore it was this like a state imposing itself and crushing individuality. So although it was nationalist, its nationalism was an imposition of the nation ego and the ruler's ego and the ruling elite's ego, and not the efflorescence of flowering of the soul of the nation. So we must distinguish the true nationalism from the false nationalism in this case.
Absolutely. Would you like to say something?
Yes, Sraddhalu, can you give us a little how the supramental activism will affect the changes that is happening on the world right now?
For the way the supramental consciousness works, in the current circumstances, again, not having sufficient number of individuals through whom it can act directly, it will work through the existing efforts of individuals, including their egos, including even their antagonism to the spiritual. So the beauty of the supramental force is because it includes every viewpoint, even the viewpoints which come to oppose it and to oppose evolution, it can utilize to accelerate evolution. So if you had to look at it this way, a wave comes opposing you. If you tilt it the right way, the wave can be joined to make a higher and more rapid lift upward by colliding with another wave. But it will be collision. It will be conflict. It will utilize existing conflicts to accelerate evolution, but through destruction and damage. Minimally, of course, of destruction. So when Mother was asked what is the supramental force doing, she said it is pushing forward, accelerating evolution by the means with the minimum of damage to humanity, because it lacks the necessary instruments. If more and more people become conscious and willing instruments of the divine, then the action will be more direct, naturally more rapid, but also needing less of the use of conflicting and harmful steps. So it needs to go zigzag because there is not active support. When there is active support, it can go straight. But it will always and inevitably push things forward. And that's why there is hope. Otherwise, we would not have hope.
Yeah.
I think there's a question from Stacy. Do you want to take that?
Right. It's a longish question.
Okay.
Your talk reminded me of Patriot Act that is in force in the US since the September 11th attack. And we in the US all know that we no longer have any sort of privacy. I am also reminded that prophets are often, or maybe always, tried to be silenced by the power system. What can we do as individuals? I think for me it is to try to have an open mind, especially if I have a negative reaction to something that I hear, but I would like to know your suggestion. Nationalism has a negative connotation in the US and can be thought as white supremacy.
Yes. So obviously the loss of privacy is global. It's not just in the US. The US set the standard and the rest of the world happily followed, where what was being done covertly earlier by governments could now be done overtly and legally, because for your own protection, for your own good, to prevent terrorist attacks, etc. So the commonest method used, and this Sri Aurobindo points to going back centuries, is to have a war, have someone attacking you, and immediately the masses give up all their liberties, give up all their common sense to the powers in order to allow a greater domination. And so this is used as a tactic by the world state to consolidate its hold on the minds of people. So certainly this is one thing which is happening everywhere. But the other point also, what you saw is the observation you made about nationalism being a bad word and associated with white supremacists. But this phrase, again, you see, it's one of those shame phrases. You are a white supremacist, and that's intended to subdue you and put you on the back foot. But if you perhaps went to the person who's being labeled with a negative connotation, the person might say, I just love my country, I love my constitution, and I want to be free. I just don't want the government to interfere. And that person will be labeled because now he is threatening to the imposed state. And so quite a bit of this label playing is happening everywhere in the world, and for this purpose, to suppress, to prevent you so that you dare not speak freely for fear of being labeled.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. There is a question from Aparna. How can we as individuals contribute towards the purpose and goal? What shall we do, really?
I didn't get that.
How can we
individuals,
as individuals contribute towards the purpose and goal?
What I already highlighted. First of all, you have to push back against these demands of the state wanting to control everything and suppress everything by precisely loving your country, loving the deeper and higher values, and then bringing that into the collective space. Not just individually, collectively. We have to express this love for the nation, love for humanity, love for the divine ideals and values, and bring them actively into our sphere of influence, so that in the collective society itself, there is a condition that will not allow the imposition of those false values, so that we may be able to push back.
Actually, it's very true. I noticed that people who love their country, they can appreciate different cultures and truly, deeply understand them. But those who do not understand their culture, they are really taking it wrongly. Yeah,
yes, exactly. And it's somehow we are splitting into two groups: those who appreciate those higher values and those who are so confused that they cannot. And the split is growing wider and wider.
Yes, there is one more, there are several more questions. How can India play its role in this situation and the contribution of individuals in this context?
So fortunately, what has happened in the last 10 years, particularly, India has increasingly begun to play its role in this matter by not following the what is called international line, which is just the line of a few powerful countries, and charting out its own course. And this has happened only in the last 10 years under the Prime Minister Narendra Modi. And I think it's important to name him because it would not happen just by the party. Just the party, earlier we had Vajpayee and others, they were not strong enough. They did not have that clarity. The bulk of the politicians in India do not have the grassroots connection to the nation's soul. A very few who have, and if such a person comes to power, as in the case of Narendra Modi, we have the benefit that he has been able to chart an independent route. I'm not saying he has not made mistakes. I'm sure he will make mistakes. He is only human. But if the attempt is there to live by the right values, then even those mistakes will get corrected and we will be guided. So certainly India has set a new direction. And as a result, you find suddenly in the last 3 years particularly, from all over the world, there's a reaching out to India on a new basis of respect and mutuality, which has been beneficial to the extent that India has actually been able to influence certain global affairs according to its soul values. But it's only the beginning, much more to follow.
Thank you. There is Makrant's raising hand. Makrant, come forward, please.
Thank you. Hello, Sraddhalu. Namaste.
Namaste.
I'm sorry I missed the first 15 minutes or so because I was busy in some activity which I couldn't get out of. Anyhow, I wasn't going to actually ask this question, but since you've named the Prime Minister, I want to ask you about the part of the talk that I heard, which is the increasing curbing of individual liberties and freedoms by the state. And this we see all over the world, not just in, regimes which are recognizably authoritarian or totalitarian, even China, Russia, Turkey and so forth, but also in democracies, also in the US. With tremendous surveillance. Recently, Elon Musk made a point about how dangerous AI is going to be in terms of the amount of control it's going to have.
It's already become.
It's already.
What he's saying is what has already happened.
Exactly. So now coming to India, how do you respond to the charge that under this regime, especially in the last, 5 years, there's been an increasing curtailment of liberties. There is a muzzling of the press. The big corporate houses have bought up all the mainstream media, and the social media is being, as it were, controlled by these bots, BOTS, which are also BOUGHTS, because these are all paid programs and programmers sitting in offices. And you can see this on Twitter, I have more than 100,000 followers, and I have a sense of how the entire narrative is being controlled. Now, I'll just now finish. I know you want to answer the question, but Sri Aurobindo has always stressed the importance of freedom, for one's spiritual growth, and the pluralism of India, the diversity is, and we've always understood that, unity is not uniformity. So in the light of what Sri Aurobindo said, how do you respond to the charge that there's an increasing curtailment of individual liberties, the muzzling of civil society?
So
yes,
you've raised several points. One is about this charge of civil liberties. Not true. What has happened in the last few decades, we have seen the entire media was corrupt. It was paid and everyone knew it. And it was paid to a degree. We even had some sting operations where the media heads would say, okay, for so many lakhs of rupees, we will give you a campaign which will promote X or Y or Z. We saw this during the COVID itself when $100 million were given to promote certain brands and certain companies, and I don't name it, but and that was given, and it was openly stated in the media that they were paying the media for this. We saw this in the New Delhi Chief Minister paying 1,000 crores to media only for what? To swing the media reports in favor of his government. So this has been endemic in India going back so many decades. For the first time, the Enforcement Directorate, ED as it's called in India, actually has been given a free hand. You can check anybody, and wherever you find crimes being committed, you can seize them, including politicians who were the most corrupt. So yes, politicians have been put behind bars, but with evidence of massive troves of cash going into equivalent of millions of dollars of cash sitting in their homes or in their drivers' homes, and the media who were receiving large funds in millions of dollars to fund operations intended to break up India. So certainly this is not acceptable under civil liberties. This is misuse of the civil liberties. See, the problem of freedom and tolerance is you are free and you tolerate a force that comes intolerant, that comes to destroy you. It enters into your mechanism of election, becomes by use of money, power and other coercion, gets elected and then turns around and destroys the system which elected it and dominates it. This is what you saw in the left coming to power in West Bengal, isn't it? And they entrench themselves afterwards through the corruption means. So if you tolerate the intolerant, they seize your tolerance and destroy it. That's not acceptable. Your tolerance has to be with things which value the same tolerance. So there has to be a recognition that yes, if there is a corruption happening, whether in the media or in the politicians, they need to go behind bars so that this ends somewhere. And this has been happening under the Modi government in a way which is very transparent. And even when the Supreme Court has been supportive of those corrupt people, it has not been able to avoid the evidence which was provided. And with that, there's a huge cleanup that is taking place. For the first time, we can see in public space, among politicians and in the media, that you can not do wrong and get away with it. You will be arrested, you will be exposed. This is a relief for the common man. So it's a very different story that the Western media paints of what's happening in India, and that's not accurate. What's happening in India is very different. There's a cleanup taking place, and a massive one. And this was needed. Otherwise, the system itself has been so corrupted that there's no hope for goodness to survive. And I think the other point you made about what Elon Musk points to, yes, all of that we need to understand. In different countries, the degree of corruption and the form of corruption may vary. But as long as people see that the corrupt get away with it, you will never have a hope that the change will come. And you have to see the corrupt being taken to task. And with that will come a pushback from the other corrupt people in the system who will now attack you for threatening them. But it's a necessary passage humanity has to go through. One of the features, and to complete this HP's question, one of the features the mother observed about the supramental consciousness and its working, she said that when the supramental force begins to work more and more, one of the things which will happen is you will not be able to keep a secret. Everything will come out into the open. And we are seeing that happen today, not just with hacking and not just with leaks, WikiLeaks or otherwise, but in ways which earlier you could not avoid. Today, if a crime takes place in broad daylight, you have 10 people who are recording it and streaming it live. And there is no way you can avoid that. So the criminals are really afraid. If a crime takes place, there are the same monitors which are being used by the government to spy on you in certain parts can be turned around and used also to attack the criminals. So there is a dual use for all these technologies, and hopefully if the consciousness in the collective changes enough, the same technologies will be a means for us to come to a much better form of governance. And Vishal has asked this question that Mother said India would show a new way out of capitalism, not just a repetition of capitalism and socialism. Yes, we might even say some kind of a idealistic pragmatism, if we may call it that. We are seeing that actually happen in India. So you saw when there was this war between Ukraine and Russia, India took a side, and the side was for ending the war, but continued to trade with both sides because it served the Indian interest. And that's a different way of thinking, which has not been seen so far in India or among many other countries. And there is a way we can do this with goodwill, with goodness, with a higher ideal. If we align ourselves all as much as possible with the soul values and with the soul of the nation, in this case, love Mother India, serve Mother India, serve the Divine Mother in Mother Earth and love her. And with that, more and more of us can awaken to what is true, what is real, and what is lasting, pouring from your heart as love, wisdom, and strength to do what is right. And this would be our way forward individually and collectively. Perhaps we can end with a concentration in this aspiration for us individually and for all humanity collectively. Namaste.
Namaste.
Thank you, Sraddhalu. Namaste.